welcome to the fourth in our Lent course series. We've been thinking particularly about this book here, God and the Pandemic by NT Wright. And the theme, if you like, of this course is about groaning. We'll be doing some more groaning today. I hope you'll enjoy today's session. Last week we were thinking about Jesus in the Bible and how Jesus lives in us. It's not just a visit, it's a stay forever. And this week I asked you to try and look at Romans chapter 8. And for those who don't know the book of Romans, it's a letter written by Paul. It talks a lot about the rules, if you like, of the Christian faith, about how sin works and how sin has a hold on us. But then Jesus has set us free from sin. And verse 8 starts with the famous words, "There is no condemnation for those who love the Lord." So it's a turning point in this letter. So here's the good news. Here we go. And the themes in this chapter are, no condemnation now because we're in Jesus. Living by the Spirit, not by the flesh. This idea that we're God's children and we're heirs in the kingdom. And also that we are more than conquerors. And it ends, of course, with the famous words about nothing can separate us from God. So it's a chapter full of good news. But it's also a chapter with some challenges in it as well. I'd like to think, first of all, in this session, about something that might have shocked you in the news over the last year or maybe over the last few years. Going back a way, I'm still shocked by that image of the little boy they found on a beach. Do you remember that one? That still sends shockwaves through me when I see that picture. And even the other day when we saw pictures of protesters being arrested in London for commemorating Sarah Everard, it still shocks us, doesn't it, these images? So I wonder, just for a minute, have a think on what news has left you speechless. What news or images have left you without any words to say as a result? I'll give you a minute to think about that. Okay. It's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes when things are so shocking or bad, all we can do is just stand there speechless, isn't it? The book talks about groaning particularly, and in Romans 8 there's quite a few bits about groaning. I'll just read a bit to you from verse 19. "For the creation, our creation that is, waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." Sometimes all we can do is groan, but there are times when there's something to be done, isn't there? In the book, Wright talks about the early church and how about in the 1st century AD there was a great famine throughout Asia Minor, but the church stood up and started to do things to help. And this is an example of the first time that a multicultural, multi-race, multi-background sort of organisation worked together to help mankind. Now, we talk about moaning and groaning. I want us to have a quick think about what's the difference between moaning and groaning. I'll give you a minute to have a think about that. It's an interesting one, isn't it? And it might be different for different people. Here's my working way of thinking about moaning and groaning. For me, moaning is where we say, I think there's a better way of doing this, you know. We look at something and think, I could have done that better, and here's how. With groaning, that's when we just don't know what to do. We're just left without the words to say. That's just my working definition of those two terms. The book talks about the children of Israel in Egypt. If you know the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus, you know the people of Israel, which by now was quite a large group of people, about sort of 400,000 people. They'd ended up in Egypt. And if you want to find out, read the book of Genesis and see how they ended up there. But they didn't choose to go there in a sort of particular way. They just ended up there because that's the way they needed to survive the famine that was going on at the time. And once they were there, they settled there, they lived there. That's how it went. But of course they ended up as slaves in the country, working for nothing. Think about the environment they were in at that time. Slaves, very little food, treated harshly. Of course, they started to groan and perhaps moan as well. There are some things which, if you like, are more like moans, and we think, well, this could be done better. And there are some things which I think are more like groans, that we just think, what's to be done? Nothing. Nothing I can do to help the situation. So using the horizontal, what do you think meter, we don't normally do it this way, but using this way, I'm going to say some things coming up, and I want you to think about, is it something that I feel I can do something about, or is it something where I'm powerless and I'm just going to groan? Is it a moan or a groan? Okay? So if I say these things, you just put your hand up and see where you fit onto this scale. What about the environment? Now we see a lot of programs about how the environment's being destroyed. We see pictures of the sea full up with plastic. We hear stories about forest fires and the way the environment is changing. Is this something we can do anything about? Or is it something where we feel totally powerless? What do you think? Interesting. What about issues like child poverty? Or vaccinating the world? You know, we're happy that our country is getting the vaccine, but what about poor places where they can't afford it? Is that something we can do something about? Can we moan? Or is it just a groan that we can't do anything about and we're just left stuck with it as it is? Okay, here's another one then. What about refugees? Is that something we can do something about, or is it something we can't? And as with a lot of these things, sometimes it's our mindset, isn't it? If we fill our heads with information about, oh, they shouldn't bother coming here, they're getting themselves in their own trouble. Maybe that's the beginning of how we start to change our minds. I don't know. What about things internationally, like we see in the news about Myanmar and China oppressing their own people? Is that something that we can do something about? Or is that something completely out of our hands? And finally, what about what I've called global ignorance? That's people who feel that the virus is a fake, or that the vaccine is not going to help you, or that Donald Trump won the election, or the world is flat, or any of these things. Are these things we can do something about, or are they things where we just sit and watch, dumbstruck at what's going on around us? What about that? difficult, isn't it? And sometimes the wisest would say that the small things that we do can make a difference, but it might feel that we can't make a difference. Interesting. Back to thinking about creation groaning though for a minute. When you hear about creation groaning, and we know it's in the context of Romans 8, it's because creation is waiting for us to come into our inheritance. But what springs to mind when you hear about creation groaning? So when we put it in the context of creation groaning, waiting for us, the children of God, to come into our inheritance, I want to know, here's a question for you. Maybe you can write it on a bit of paper, or just have a think. What is our inheritance as Christians? What are we inheriting? Have a think. In the book, Tom Wright tells us that as Christians we tend to think of our inheritance as being heaven. But of course, there's quite a lot for us to inherit right in front of us on the earth. In Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 5, what does Jesus say? He doesn't say the meek will inherit something way up there in the blue yonder. The meek will inherit the earth. There's all about Jesus' teaching of the kingdom, which is to do with the here and now, rather than just pie in the sky when you die. So, what do we think of as our inheritance? In the book of Revelation, we can hear about the new heavens and the new earth that is coming down when Jesus comes back. But perhaps a good way to think about it, as we said earlier, is the people of Israel. And they were hoping for the promised land, weren't they? Perhaps that's our inheritance, the promised land. Question then, what is our promised land? What's that thing that we're looking forward to more than anything else? Now, for many of us, it might be something like, winning the lottery or going on holiday. But thinking about our faith, what's that promised land that we wish God would take us into now rather than in a few weeks' time? Maybe it's having prayers answered. Maybe it's God dealing with something in our lives that is festering. What for us is our promised land? I'll leave you to think about that for a minute. The book has a great quote for what the promised land is and what our inheritance is. It calls us this: the house we all want to live in. Now, in our place, Pauline and Harry have been thinking about a new house for Harry to live in. So it's kind of quite real to us looking on Zoopla and places like that for a new home. And you get into it, don't you? You sort of, it captures your imagination, this new place you can live in, what it'd be like, and how much better it might be living in that place rather than this place. But while we're thinking about that and the promised land and the future that we've got, that we're groaning for, here's another weird thought that comes out of Romans 8. And it's this, I'll read it for you, beginning at verse 26. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So we've got the world groaning, we're groaning, And guess what? The Holy Spirit is groaning too. He's praying for us. And we know that Jesus is also praying for us. If you don't believe me, read John chapters 14 to 17. Jesus is praying for us. So here's the thought. What is the Holy Spirit and what is Jesus praying for? Maybe this week we could give some time in our quiet times to simply asking that question, saying, Lord, what are you praying for in my life? What are you praying for in this area in the church? What is your prayer? It's a good thing to know, isn't it? Because I always think Jesus' prayers maybe are more likely to be answered than mine, because I often pray for some stupid things. So we're thinking about groaning, and we even know that the Holy Spirit groans for us. But what about people outside of the church? What about the creation outside of what we see as being our faith and our belief? Well, in the book, Tom Wright calls us to be at that point where the world is groaning. And sometimes when you're with somebody or something that's groaning, there's nothing you can really say. A couple of weeks ago, we were thinking about the Old Testament in the book of Job. Do you remember Job ends up not only with nothing from being a very rich, prosperous man with a big family, he ends up with nothing, but also he's ill and covered in sores. And then his friends come and offer him wonderful words of wisdom. And you can't but think that if his friends had just shut up and said nothing, just sat with him there on the ground, that would have been much better. Sometimes as a church we're tempted to jump in with good advice, aren't we? But when all we need to do, as Tom Wright says, is just to stand with people at their point of need. And as Anglicans, sometimes we can be a bit wordy. Of course, it's in a good way. But our Anglican faith is full of words, isn't it? And as a church, we have words for every occasion you could ever think of. But if it's good for us just to be quiet and to sit with people in their point of need, how could we as a church be more visual and perhaps a bit less wordy? Have a think about that for a minute. Perhaps you could write a suggestion on your bit of paper. Think about it. So to sum up, as we've been looking at this chapter in Tom Wright's book, we as individuals and as a church will be faced with situations where words will fail us. And in these situations, we just need to stand with people and be seen to be standing with people. We've also learnt that we have an inheritance. And perhaps you never knew that, but it's good news, isn't it? We have an inheritance from God. And guess what? It's not pie in the sky when we die. It's cake on the plate while you wait. It's right in front of us. That's good news, isn't it? And we've also heard that the Holy Spirit is praying for us, and Jesus is praying for us. Don't you want to know what they're praying? I do. And I've been hearing from God about what their prayers are. And sometime or other I'll tell you what they are. But it'd be different for you to what it is for me. So, for next time, the chapter heading is, where do we go from here? So between now and then, I'd invite you to ask Jesus to reveal what he and the Holy Spirit are praying for you in your life and in our church and in the area. Also, this final chapter in the book talks a lot about the Easter story, about resurrection, about a new start for us. Our churches will be resurrected, brought back to life, if you like. So I want you to think about how different might church be when we go back to normal life. There's lots to think about there, isn't there? But I want to challenge you. Maybe God will do a new thing when we open up again. So perhaps that's something to think about for next time. Till then, stay safe, keep well, and I hope to see you soon. Look after yourselves. Bye now.